All right. Okay. So hopefully everyone can see my screen here. This is welcome everyone again. This is my fourth and final presentation on the Rubin family, and tonight we are going to discuss the Rubin family Y-DNA. We'll discuss briefly at the outset here some terminology and discuss what Y-DNA is. And then the bulk of the presentation, we're going to talk about a family member who took a Y-DNA test and what those results showed. And then we're going to spend the second half of the presentation talking about two innovative ways that we furthered the research into the Rubin family line. So without further ado, let's start the presentation. So, and anyone, again, feel free to ask questions either through the chat or pipe in. I might even pause after. There are going to be 3 parts to this presentation. After each part, I might also elicit questions too, if you want, if you have them. So, a Y-DNA test. What does it do? So, first off, it's a test that can only be taken by males. It looks at a very strict ancestry line, and it's one's direct paternal line. So if a male takes it, it looks only at one's father's line. And why is that? Because it is looking at the Y chromosome. The Y chromosome is passed from father to son, and that's the only inheritance path. It does not recombine. As a sex chromosome, it does not recombine with anything else. It's just passed intact. However, what we do know is that the Y-DNA does mutate very slowly. And we'll talk about these types of mutations. But thanks to these mutations in the Y-DNA, we can trace migration patterns over very, very long periods of time. And when I talk about very long periods of time, we're going to be talking about ancient history tonight, going back many thousands of years. And it's very different than traditional genealogy that just focuses in on, the last couple hundred years. We're going to shoot way further back into history and see where the Rubin paternal line was located back in history. And so because its focus is on ancient history, it tends to be a much less useful test for finding cousins to connect with on a family tree. So when people ask me, I want to take a DNA test, I rarely tell them to use the Y-DNA because oftentimes they want to, find cousins that they want to be able to, find on their tree or learn about their ethnicity. And Y-DNA is a much more specific focus on the direct paternal line and ancient migration patterns. So typically, it's hard to find cousins. And it's especially true for Ashkenazi Jews because the adoption of surnames in Ashkenazi Jewry, for the most part, only took place in the last 250, 300 years. Oftentimes, when we're talking about Y-DNA, you're not going to find relatives closer than 500 years ago. And so, as we'll see in this presentation, there are a lot of different surnames that all share a common ancestor, and the reason for that is they all trace back before the advent of surnames, and so it's hard to find cousins with the same surname through Y-DNA testing. I also want to spend a slide to talk about Y-DNA versus autosomal DNA. Autosomal DNA is much more common when we talk about DNA testing. So again, Y-DNA test just focuses on the paternal line of ancestry. It looks at that Y chromosome that's passed down from father to son. What I like to say, it provides insights on a time span of thousands of years. It's a narrow, but it's a deep test because you're looking way back into history. And you can see on the left-hand side, the blue tracing of the inheritance pattern from father to son. That's the Y-DNA line. An autosomal DNA test, shortened as ATDNA, it looks at DNA inherited from all of one's ancestry. It comes through the 22 pairs of autosomes, and you inherit 50% of that from each parent. So you can see on the diagram here, your autosomal DNA comes from all lines of your ancestry, from You get basically 50% from each parent, 25% from each grandparent, and 12.5% from each great-grandparent, and so on. But because of that, it gets diluted with each subsequent generation. So, right, if you go back far enough, usually it's best for finding cousins that are third cousins and closer. Once you get further and further away, you might not share DNA, autosomal DNA, with relatives, and the DNA gets diluted. So what we say is that autosomal DNA provides insights on all of your lines of ancestry, but only really within the past 200 to 400 years. You can't look further back in time to get information on that. So again, the way to characterize autosomal DNA, it's got a very broad reach, but it's relatively shallow in terms of going back in time. So hopefully this slide just helps you better understand the difference between Y-DNA and autosomal DNA. The autosomal DNA testing sites are the ones that are very famous: 23andMe, MyHeritage, and of course Ancestry. Y-DNA is really a specialty of a company called Family Tree DNA, which is based in Houston. And they really have a monopoly on Y-DNA testing. So I think this is the hardest slide in terms of the terminology. I'm going to go over some of this terminology. But if you are able to understand this, you understand basically a lot of the concepts when we talk about Y-DNA and Y-DNA inheritance. So I will try my best to explain the terminology. If you do have questions, feel free to ask. There are no bad questions. This is new for a lot of people when we talk about Y-DNA terminology. And so I want to make sure that I try and explain the best that I can. But in the event that you have questions, please feel free to ask. So the first important term that we talk about with Y-DNA is called a haplogroup. So a haplogroup is a genetic population, a group of people who we know all share a common paternal ancestor. So if you're all from the same haplogroup, you share a common paternal line ancestor. And how do we know that? Well, a haplogroup is characterized by sharing the same mutations. So if everyone in the group is part of the same haplogroup, that means they all share the same mutations in their Y-DNA. And those mutations are called SNPs, single nucleotide polymorphisms. That's another term for mutations. So everyone who is part of the same haplogroup shares the same mutations. So haplogroups help mark a period of time when your group branched off from a distinct line by forming a new mutation that is then passed on to its many descendants. And there are major haplogroups that get the letters A through T. And then there are, sub-branches, sub-haplogroups. We call them subclads. Those are just sub-branches within a major haplogroup. And they have letters and numbers that characterize them. So I want to turn your attention to the right-hand side of the slide, which really provides a very simple, illustrative example of what we're talking about when we talk about haplogroups. So at the very top here is the ancestral line that's represented by a black line. Okay, there are no mutations that exist on this line. That is the earliest ancestor. We can apply this to mankind and what we call Y chromosomal Adam, who lived in Africa about, let's say, 250,000 years ago. Didn't have any mutations on the Y-DNA line, okay? But again, in this simple example, this is the early ancestor, no mutations. And then, as this person has two sons, one son who has the exact same DNA as the father. This is on the left-hand side. It's also black. On the right-hand side, we have the black, but there is a new red dot that formed. And that is a mutation that formed. When the Y-DNA was passed on to father to son, the Y-DNA had a little mutation, something new changed in the DNA, and there was a little red dot that formed that's characterizing a mutation. And that formed a new branch of the tree. Okay? And what we would say is that every descendant of the person on the right, we're going to call this haplogroup B. The one up top is haplogroup A. It creates a new haplogroup, a new branch of the tree, and it's called haplogroup B. That's what we call it because it has the red mutation. And what we'll say is that any descendant of B is going to have that red mutation for the end of time. Okay? Everyone in the modern day population is going to have that red mutation. That means they must have descended from B. Okay? And not from the brother of B. And then if we take it one more generation, there is an additional mutation for each of these lines. So the one that didn't have a mutation has two sons. One that continues to have no mutation is still haplogroup A. And then there's a green mutation that forms. That's haplogroup C. It's a new haplogroup that forms. And then over here, you have the red has an additional mutation. That's a blue mutation. That becomes haplogroup D. And there's another son who did not have any new mutations. He stays haplogroup B. And so what we see today, all we see here is the modern population with all of these mutations or lack of mutations that have accrued. We actually don't, we don't have any insight into testers from thousands of years ago. But based off of the nesting of the mutations, we can determine exactly where people fit in terms of their paternal lines. And there's a lot of different sub-branches, but they all fit into a part of the tree. I like to term it like they're giant Russian nesting dolls. And as you get into smaller and smaller branches, it divides into lots of different groups, but you can see that all of them can share a common ancestor. So what we can see here on this example, D, because he has the blue and the red mutation, he is actually a closer relative to B, who also has that red mutation, than D is to C or A. So that's sort of the conclusion that you want to be able to get, is that since D shares this mutation with B, but he has an additional mutation, he's closer to B, and he's a more distant relative to C and A. Hopefully, this example is just helpful to explain, how we do this sort of branching off of the tree, but we do this for all of mankind. There is this wide DNA tree that spans all of mankind, and it has many, many sub-branches, and we're going to just talk about the Rubin branch today. So I guess maybe before I go on, does anyone have any questions before I move on? I know it's a lot of terminology. This is the most difficult slide. Everything else that we're going to talk about is going to be application, and it will be, I guess, easier to follow. But hopefully, if anyone has any questions, this might be a good time before we go into the results and stuff.
How often do these mutations occur?
That's a great question. So they're random. They're random, so we don't actually know for certain, there isn't a clear pattern to them. What we have found in testing is that they seem to occur between 50 and 150 years. I've seen different estimates, but it could be, it's usually not every generation. Okay, right? That would be 25, 30 years. It could be every 2 generations a new mutation forms. It could be every 4, 5, 6 generations. And we're going to discuss that here in this presentation, actually. We're going to have some insights into when mutations occurred and when they didn't. It's very different than, say, the Landau family, where the data is a little different. So it's a great question, but to have in mind, a new mutation forms every 50 to 150 years. So it can be many generations pass where the Y DNA is intact completely. And I guess I should also point out, this is a good point, good time to say it, is that when I say mutation, it does not mean something that's bad, okay? That's why I like this colors. They're just colors. They're just changes in your DNA, in your Y DNA, and to the best of our knowledge, all of these Y DNA mutations we're going to talk about are neither good or bad. They don't really have any noticeable effect at all on one's health or anything. There's no effect. Now, there are mutations that can occur in the Y DNA, in the Y chromosome, that are bad and that can affect spermogenesis. None of the mutations that we're going to talk about today have anything to do with that. It is neither good or bad. It's just a change in when the DNA is copied and replicated, a new mutation arises that then gets passed on to the subsequent generations. That's all it is. So I know mutation sometimes can have a negative reading, but there's no judgment about it at all. And that's why I like the color coding. It's just like a signal of a branch of the family. All right.
Jeremy, I've got a
Yeah.
question.
Okay.
Back a step. When you were saying that the DNA that looks at everything test
Yes.
does, that it thins out when you go back beyond third cousins.
Yes.
Now, why couldn't we go back 300 years on that one?
Okay, that's a great question. So you inherit, right, an equal, let's say, around an equal percentage from each ancestor, but someone else who's a cousin, let's give a good example of a second great grandparent. Okay, so we talked about a grandparent. Each grandparent you inherit 25%. Each great grandparent is 12.5%. And it's 6.25% from each second great grandparent. Okay, and that's not a lot of DNA. And let's say you're a third cousin. Okay, there's a chance that even though they descend from the same great grandparents, they could have inherited an entirely different 6.25% and share no noticeable DNA in common with you. It gets even more pronounced as you get to even further generations. It can happen with third cousins. It's rare in third cousins, but with fourth cousins and fifth cousins, it happens all the time. You actually don't share any DNA in common with them, but you are related to them. You descend from the same ancestors, but you don't have any autosomal DNA. Because just the way the inheritance patterns worked out, you inherited part of, let's say, chromosome 1, but they inherited from that ancestor chromosome 10, and it just doesn't overlap. So it doesn't show a shared match, because you don't share the same segment of DNA.
So if you were to look at Helena Rubin's DNA, if you were to, and to connect it back, so that's Marie Lehman's mother. That for you is your father's mother's mother. By the time you get there, you're saying that her descendants are not likely to be useful because it's back to those 6%, and you're not going to see much.
There is insight in testing. I have tested siblings, like descendants of siblings of Helena, and there is DNA in common that we share. And remember, for me, this is why with autosomal DNA, it's highly recommended you always test the oldest living member in your line, because they have more of their ancestors' DNA in them, right? Like, let's say my grandpa Henry had been alive, right? I only inherited 25% of my DNA from him, but he has 100% of his DNA from all of his ancestors, and there's a lot more DNA to test. So that is the reason why I have tested my 3 living grandparents, and we'll touch on it briefly, why I undertook a big analysis of my father and his 2 brothers' DNA tests, because it held really important insights into their ancestral lines. But you're exactly right. That's why I try and test the older generations, because they provide so much insight. For me, I found it many times DNA that either my father or uncles have that connect to cousins. They have DNA that I didn't inherit. I don't share DNA in common maybe with a cousin, but my father does. I think there are lots of examples of that. Or I share much less DNA than, let's say, my father does. And even more so, right, with a grandparent, with like Uncle Rene or Grandpa Henry's generation. So, again, that's why it's important to test the oldest living relative. You do not have to do that at all for Y-DNA. In fact, you test one person. I've tested my Y-DNA for the Lehman line, and that's it. There's no need for any other Lehman to test. Because again, the insights are for hundreds of years ago and thousands of years ago.
Thank you.
All right, so I think we'll move on to the first half of the presentation. Basically, part 1, we're going to talk about a guy named Ron Rubin and his Y-DNA test. So, in order to perform Y-DNA testing, right, I needed to find a male cousin of ours from the Rubin family whose last name is Rubin and descends through the paternal line through the Rubin family. And, it's actually not as easy as it might think, okay? Because I spent over an hour talking about Moses Rubin and his whole family, right? That's Helena Rubin's father. And guess what? Out of all of his descendants, okay, and he had 9 children, there are only 2 people I know who still have who are males with the Rubin line, and they live in Israel. Okay, and that's a little bit harder to test, and I found them very late. I didn't find them that so early on, and so from Moses Rubin's descendants, there are not many people with the Rubin surname today, and this is common across a lot of different surnames. But I just wanted to say that what is really important when doing genealogy is to build out laterally with the family tree and then build back down, because you might have to look further back in the tree to find adequate, testers who have that surname that you're looking for. And so, fortunately for me, I didn't have to go that much further back. Moses Rubin had a brother named Sender Asher Rubin, and his great-grandson, I have the listing here of how he's connected to Menachem Mendel Rubin. That's but this is Sender Asher. That's Moses Rubin's brother. His great-grandson is a guy named Ron Rubin, who lives on Long Island. And I found him through, autosomal DNA. He shows up as a match to me and a match to my father on autosomal DNA. I looked at his tree, and I figured out that he was from our Rubin family. Not only that, it was really special connecting with him. His father survived the Holocaust. His father actually lost his whole first family in the Holocaust, remarried after the war, and he was a product of the second marriage. Ron Rubin is the product of the second marriage. Ron Rubin had no information about his grandparents, his Rubin grandparents. And when I connected with him, I had photos to share with him. I had that menu of his grandparents' wedding back in 1899 and all this information to share about the Rubin line. And it was really very special connecting with him. Ron is a social worker. He provides professional counseling services. And again, I've talked with him on the phone. I haven't met with him in person. Hopefully I'll be able to do that soon because he doesn't live far away from me. So I asked him, he is a male line Rubin descendant, right? Rubin, son of Rubin, son of Rubin, son of Rubin, all the way down the line. He checks all the boxes. I was very excited so I asked him, would you take a Y-DNA test? And he said yes, he was interested. He wanted to see what the results would be. And so I wanted to look back and see what's the ancient history of the Rubin line. So that's what we're going to discuss over the next few slides. We're going to, go back far back in history. All right. So we got his results, his big Y-DNA results, just earlier this year in the late springtime. So this is just a few months ago. All this material is going to be just within the last 6 months of research. And we're going to start back really far back in time. So these haplogroups, the major haplogroups, took place tens of thousands of years ago. And Ron Rubin is from this major haplogroup called E. And E formed about 65,000 years ago. So a very, very long time ago. We will talk briefly about that. And then as we get close, we're going to go from really far back in history, and then we're going to go closer and closer to the present day based off of the mutations, and getting into closer and closer sub-branches, which we call subclads. So the next subgroup within E is a line called EM35. And all of those men descend from a man 19,000 years ago, but it actually was formed about 32,700 BCE. And then we're going to talk about that. And then within EM35, he descends from a mutation called EM123 that formed about 17,000 years ago. And then we're going to go into a little bit closer to the present, EY14891, where it formed about 7,600 years ago. But we'll talk about it. Everyone who's within EY14891 is Jewish today. And they all share a common ancestor from about 800 CE. Again, this is a high-level overview. We're going to go into detail about all of this stuff. Within EY14891, the next one is EY18621. That everyone from there has a common ancestor from 950 CE, so we're getting a little bit closer to the present day. And then finally, the terminal haplogroup, the last haplogroup from Ron Rubin's test, was EA 18889 from 1250 CE. The key important point is everyone who's part of these three haplogroups, okay, everyone is Jewish today from these groups. And that this line has been Jewish since the advent of Judaism, or we'll talk about it, but all of the adjacent lines only connect, the non-Jewish lines only connect with this line well before the advent of Judaism. All right. So what I did here is put a timeline of human history and sort of place the formation of the different haplogroups and their subclads as we get closer and closer to the present day. So again, the first migration out of Africa was about 100,000 years ago. E formed 65,000 years ago. And we'll talk about where it formed in the world. And then EM35, we're getting 30,000 years ago. EM123, we're getting to 19,000 years ago, the height of the last ice age, right? And then E14891, we're getting closer to, the ancient world. It's still 5600 BCE. And then we have a big jump here, and this is important. This is a big jump in time. EY 18621 and EA 18889. Again, we will go over all of this, but I think this is just helpful to see some notable moments in human history, and we're going really far back in time to go back 65,000 years ago. All right. So E is the major haplogroup. I really wanted to start on EM35 because that's the next group below it. EM35 formed about 35,000 years ago. So what we believe is that it formed, where were people living 35,000 years ago? The Rubin paternal line ancestors, they probably were living around the Horn of Africa, which is right over here. Think, Somalia today, and around those areas by the Red Sea. And then they dispersed, all of the descendants of EM35 dispersed through North Africa in the Near East. And so this is actually, on the bottom right here, this is where we really see EM35 descendants today. Everyone who share a common paternal line ancestor from 35,000 years ago, this is actually where they're found today. There's a big cluster in the Horn of Africa and in the Arabian Peninsula. And you see a lot in northwestern Africa, like Morocco, in the Berbers. And so the way that we've scientists have termed it is that you can really see the diffusion of Afro-Asiatic languages through EM35. So there's 6 main branches of languages where basically they probably can get traced to ancestors who were from EM35. So Berber languages, again, that's right in Morocco. Chadic, that's in Chad. Cushitic, Egyptian, Omotic, and all Semitic languages, they can be traced from ancestors who were part of potentially EM35. Again, these are where the Afro-Asiatic language branches were in these areas. And so EM35 and where the descendants went today, track very closely with that. Okay. What I have here is a phylogenetic tree. And I think these can be very helpful to see all the different subbranches that they've been able to find in haplogroup EM35. So here, up on top is you're getting closer to that major haplogroup E. Over here is EM35. There's then 2 different mutations that occurred. There's a whole branch, that's the L539 branch. There's the Z827 branch. And from there, the Rubin line descends from Z830, and then Z1145, and then M123, EM123. So there were a few other mutations in the line, and we descend from EM123, that's part of EZ830. But you can see there are all these different branches, and you can see where they're found today. So some are in the Europe, Near East, there's some that are in Somalia, North Africa. We're going to talk about EM123, But Ethiopia, Arabia, it's all those places that we've been talking about are where these EM35 descendants are today. And the Rubin line is from EM123. So I want to talk about some important descendants from EM35. I just want to highlight again that EM123 is part of EZ830. And we're going to talk about EZ830 because a 2016 study tested ancient DNA samples from the Mesolithic period. So that's over 10,000 years ago. And it was part of this culture called the Natufian culture in Israel. Okay, so we're talking about in Israel from, we're going to say between 11,500 and 15,000 years ago. We believe the Natufians were the world's oldest sedentary community. Okay, and when they tested the ancient DNA, they can take DNA from like the bones of these ancient remains. They found males who were part of EZ830, which is what the Rubin line is part of. Okay? So there were Natufians, males, who were who were living in Israel 10,000 to 15,000 years ago. And what's believed is that the Natufian culture may have contributed to the domestication of certain crops, and they may have been responsible for the advent of agriculture. In fact, the earliest evidence of agriculture in the world, which was the cultivation of rye cereal, and the oldest known evidence of beer, which goes back to 13,000 BCE in Haifa, was found in the Natufian culture. So I just want to say that we're Rubin line ancestors, or very, relatively close cousins on that ancestral line, who were living in Israel 10 to 15,000 years ago, which is really remarkable. Okay. The other interesting thing that I want to highlight here is that, and I've done a lot of research into other Y-DNA lines. EM35 and all of those descendants, they've been found in Israel, right? Going back 10 to 15,000 years ago, but they have not been found in other areas where there are a lot of ancient DNA, such as Anatolia, near the Caucasus, or in Iran. And so what that says is that basically the northern extent that the EM35 branch was in the Levant, in Israel. They didn't really extend out into Iran. They didn't extend up north into the Caucasus. They definitely were living in Israel 10 to 15,000 years ago, but they didn't extend much further out in the Near East, which is very interesting. It differs a lot from other lines. But it's really cool that we know that there are Natufian culture that, again, that EM123 is also a descendant of EZ830. All right. So now we're going to discuss EM123, which is that sub-branch, a subclad of EM35. This formed 19,000 years ago during the last ice age. So where do people think it was formed? Well, over here on the left-hand side, you can see where the descendants of EM123 today. Everyone who has the EM123 mutation, where they live today. Look where it's centered. Right in the Near East, right around Israel. Okay? Right in the Near East and in the Levant. And so you also see a southern branch all the way down, down the Red Sea. And so, what it's believed is that somewhere between the southern Levant and Ethiopia is where EM123, where that first mutation arose during the last ice age. That's where our ancestors were living, either in the Levant or as far south as Ethiopia. And I do want to talk about EM123 a little bit more because there are several lineages from EM123 that are Jewish today. Actually, there are more than several. There are a bunch. And so because of that, it is believed to be one of the major founding lineages of the Jewish people. And I want to take a step back and just say that within the Bible, we talk about the tribal nature of the Jewish people, and we see that in the Y-DNA of male lines. There are many different paternal lines that trace back to the Middle East during biblical times and may have been Jewish during the biblical era. And what I was saying here is that EM 123, because there's so many of these lines, it is presumed that they probably were all living in the Levant during biblical times because there's so many. About 10 to 20% of Ashkenazi males are part of EM 123, and about 5% of Sephardic and Mizrahi are part of EM 123. So this is from an earlier study, it's actually back in 2009, but it just shows the percentages of Ashkenazi Jews and non-Ashkenazi Jews of different haplogroups. This is EM 123. You can see there are more Ashkenazi Jews today that are part of EM 123. Our layman branch, which I've tested, is part of GM 377, which is entirely Ashkenazi Jews. It has not been found in non-Ashkenazi Jews. But similarly to the EM 123, it's not from Europe or anything like that. But very different history than E. All right. So we talked about EM 123. I want to show you another phylogenetic tree of the descendants of EM 123. We're getting closer and closer to the present day. Remember, this is, again, formed in the last ice age. It's believed that, again, we've talked about ancestors living in the Levant during the Neolithic period. This is, again, still pretty ancient, still thousands of years ago. And where does the Rubin line trace down to? EY 14891, which we're going to talk about, and EY 18621. I've sort of shown the boxes of where the Rubin line fits in this tree, but I really want to point out here there are so many Jewish lines that are in this tree that are descended from EM 123. So all of this is Jewish here that we're going to talk about. This line here is Jewish, and all of this group is Jewish. In fact, you may have read about a study in Erfurt, Germany, where there was a medieval remains of Jews that were allowed to do a DNA analysis, and they were able to find, out of about 30 people in the community, 10 males, okay, where they were able to get the Y DNA lines. Guess what? One of the members of the Erfurt community, they actually were part of this branch here on the right-hand side. They were part of this Jewish branch. They were one of the members of that community. Again, a pretty distant still relative to the Rubin line, not part of the Rubin line, but one of these Jewish lines was represented in the community. And then I know my grandma Liz isn't on here, but actually her paternal line, the Lichtenberg line, was another male found in that Erfurt community. The Lichtenberg line was represented in that community as well, which I thought was very interesting. Okay. All right, so I do want to spend a little bit of time on this slide. There is going to be a little bit of terminology here as well, but hopefully we can get through it. So as we get closer to the present day, now we're talking about EY 14891. And this branch today, so everyone who has tested with an EY 14891 today in the modern population, they are from Ashkenazi Jewish ancestry. Okay, but this branch formed back in 5600 BCE, a long time ago. What we can say here is that this branch exhibits what's called a strong founder effect. Okay, there are lots of different sub-branches within EY 14891, but they're more relatively recent. In fact, there was a loss of genetic variation of this line for thousands of years, and a new population emerged from a very small number of individuals about 800 CE. So there probably was just one common ancestor from all of EY 14891 who share a common ancestor from 800 CE. But they branched off of all the other adjacent lines back in 5600 BCE. So what I've shown here on this slide on the right is a map of all of the adjacent non-Jewish lines that broke off at around 5600 BCE. So they broke off from our Jewish line well before the advent of Judaism. Where are those testers living today? Well, they're very close to the Middle East. There's no European presence, really. There's Georgia and Armenia, but in addition to that, we have Cyprus, Syria, Kuwait, the UAE, and a Christian Palestinian. Those are the closest non-Jewish relatives on the Rubin line today. They're all in around the Near East, and so even though all of the testers today are in EY 14891 are from Ashkenazi Jewish lands, it seems highly likely that the origin of this branch was obviously not from Europe, it was from the Near East. Everything points to the Near East, since all of the closest relatives were there. And so when I talk about this founder effect, what I mean by that is everyone who's part of EY 14891, they share about over 60 mutations formed that differentiate them from all these other testers. That's a long period of time. If we're saying that every new mutation is somewhere between 50 and 150 years, and there were 60 mutations that occurred, that all these testers share, that they don't share with any of these testers. That is a marker of time and why they only connect with these testers very far back in time. And we sometimes see this where you have this founder effect where probably there were we call it bottlenecks where the population shrunk. There could have been it could be plague. It could have been attacks on the Jewish population where there were other Jewish lines that were connected to it that all died out and do not exist in the modern day population. Okay? But what we know is, again, the closest non-Jewish testers are from the Near East, and that all of the testers within EY 14891, their common ancestor is from 800 CE, because they all share these 60 mutations that bring us closer to the present day. All right. I want to take it a little bit closer. So within that, we're now talking about EY 18621. So now we're talking about the Ashkenazi Jewish. There are so many different branches of this tree that started flourishing around 800 CE. So starting at, there was very few lines, this is one of the few lines that survived, starting 800 CE, and then there were so many different descending lines. It became very successful in spreading, starting in 800 CE. And so we descend from a smaller branch called EY 18621, formed around 150 years later in 950 CE. And what we can say about it is that they're found all over Ashkenazi Europe. So I just show here about a little map here showing all the different Jewish migrations and expulsions. We find representatives from EY 18621 from all the way in Western Europe all the way into Eastern Europe. There is no defining characteristic. They're found all over Ashkenazi Europe. It makes it hard to tell exactly, how the migration paths occurred. But that is sometimes something that you see in these Y-DNA lines of Jews. And then this is the last slide here about the Ron Rubin part of the presentation. So we get closer to the present day. He is finally, the last mutation that he shares with any other tester is EA18889. And that common ancestor was born about 500 years ago. So everyone who's part of EA 18889 shares a common ancestor from about 1500. So we're getting closer to the present day now. And what I wanted to highlight here is there was one other tester within this group, part of the Nachod family, who also can trace their ancestry back into the 17th century like we can with our Rubin line. So I find it interesting whenever you can find a tester, again, different surname, but that has a long ancestry, it can provide insight into migration patterns. So what do we know about the Nachod family? Well, they were a prominent family in 17th century Prague. Now, I don't think our Rubin family was in Prague in the late 17th century, as I've talked about in prior presentations. I think they were in Poland, but I think what this could hint at is that it's possible that the Rubin family may have originated from Bohemian lands and then migrated eastward into Poland, maybe in the 1600s. But it may be in the 1500s, during the height, they could have been in Bohemia, they could have been in Prague. So I just have an old grave of one of the Nachod family members who is a paternal line relative of our Rubin family. But again, we probably don't share a common ancestor with the Nachod family until about 1500 CE. And I could only take the Rubin line back until the mid-1600s. So we're talking about, there's about 100 or 150 years of unknown ancestry that would connect us back to the Nachod family. So I wanted to show you, like, when you get a Y-DNA results, big Y-DNA results, you get what's called a block tree. And it's a visualization of your closest paternal line relatives along the line. And so what I mentioned is this subclad, this subgroup that Ron Rubin is a part of, there are so much differentiation in different lines that have formed. Again, it was very successful in the Ashkenazi Jewish population that there are so many different branches that formed over the last 1200 years. So what you see here are all of these adjacent lines to Ron Rubin that share a common ancestor with Ron, going back to about 950 CE. So it's about all these people here that are mentioned here share a common ancestor from about, again, 1100 years ago or so, 1050 years ago. So what you see here, though, is each of these sub-branches, for the most part, they all represent people with different surnames. So here, for example, I'll just read their names. These are, again, distant relatives, but Gary Baker, Michael Feller, Antonu Winkler. They all have different surnames. What that means is all these people who are part of this group EA 16692, they share a common ancestor before the advent of Jewish surnames. It has to go back at least 250, 300 years before they share a common ancestor. The only time that you'll see on this page with the same surname is actually on the far left here. There's a guy named Sid Wugalter and Vladislav Vugalter, and they actually do share the same surname. And so they may actually share a common ancestor. You can see it's closer to the present day. They're part of this group EY 130-230, that they actually could share a common ancestor from the last 200 or 300 years, possibly. But most of these other branches don't. And now this is what Ron Rubin's branch looks like when he first took his test. So he was part of what I mentioned was EA 18889. One of the complicating things is that sometimes the same mutation has different names. So family tree DNA, instead of using the more common terminology, they have this terminology EFGC 68205. It's the exact same thing. So they're used interchangeably. But he is part of this branch that's highlighted, and he has listed as his closest cousins, again, all from 1500 CE, not any closer, a guy named Moshe Sachs, Justin Nachod, Joseph Dax, and Robert Forst. And so, again, Justin Nachod, we know his line the best because he goes back to Prague, to the 17th century. The other men, we can't go back that far, but they are on the same paternal line. And so this is where we were. This was the state of the research after Ron Rubin's test. I'm going to stop here. Maybe I'll stay on this slide. Does anyone have questions about all of this? I know we covered a lot, going from very ancient history to closer to the modern day. But does anyone have any questions on this material? I know it's a lot to think about. All right, going once, going twice. And we're going to move on. So what we just talked about was really the ancient DNA, looking at the ancient line of the Rubin line. And it was really exciting to have Ron Rubin's test in hand and to be able to discover that information. It's, exciting to know about the Middle Eastern roots and to learn about the history of the line and to know how prominent it is in Ashkenazi testers today. That was all really exciting. But what gets even more exciting is adding on additional Y-DNA tests and using them in innovative ways. So I'm going to talk about two different testers that followed Ron Rubin's test that provided us some very interesting insights, and they were answering different questions. Okay, so the first person who I sought to take another Y-DNA test was a guy by the name of Brian Rubin. Brian Rubin, just some background on him. He is, let's say around my age, a little older than me. He lives in Minneapolis, Minnesota. He is the senior managing editor at a company called Static Media. He's also written his own novel. It's a science fiction young adult comedy called Dim Stars that he promotes on his website. So I wanted to talk about it too because it seems like he likes a lot of things related to science fiction. So the question is, why did I test him? How did I find him? So I actually want to talk about finding him first. And because I view it as a small miracle that I was able to find him and connect with him. So why do I say that? Well, earlier this year, this is not actually Y-DNA related. Earlier this year, I embarked on a very big project that is ongoing, where it's called visual phasing. And it's an advanced DNA analysis for autosomal DNA, not for Y-DNA, where you look at three siblings' DNA and compare them to each other. And you compare them with cousins. And by doing that, you can figure out and attribute all of the three siblings' DNA to specific grandparents. And so what that means is that when I go through my father's DNA, and I've done this for all of these for my father and two of his brothers who have taken DNA tests, Uncle Len and Uncle David. If Uncle Danny decides to take a DNA test, which I'd recommend, he could join the project too because it is very exciting. What I've been able to do so far with this project, and it's a lot of work. I hope to put a presentation together that will give an overview of this because it's really interesting analysis. But I've been able to attribute over 80% of each of the brothers' DNA to a specific grandparent. And that means I can find different segments of their DNA and know exactly which grandparent it came from. Why is that important? Well, my father, first of all, my father's and his brothers' grandparents have been deceased for a very long period of time. In fact, like Leo Lehman, who's the oldest, the earliest one to pass away, died in 1950, over 70 years ago. And we actually can see very clearly the DNA from Leo Lehman, let's say, that is in my father and his brother's DNA today. And from that, we can use that to compare with a random cousin who we have no idea, a random DNA match. We can look to see where those areas of DNA overlap is with my father and his brothers, and we can make a hypothesis about who the shared ancestor is through. And so I did this with my father and his brothers. There was a tester by the name of Dave Rubin, who happens to be Brian Rubin's brother. And I saw that Dave Rubin has a lot of DNA in common with my father and his brothers. He shows up as like a really close match. And all of the DNA segments of overlap are shared with the brother's grandmother, Marie Landau. And so I knew I didn't have to look at Leo Lehman's branch at all. I had to look at their family tree, build their family tree back, Dave Rubin's family tree back, and I had to be looking for either Landau or Rubin, right? And what I found is that there's a reason why Dave Rubin shares a lot of DNA in common. It's because he's connected to the Landau family. That's how I actually first found him. He actually descends from two of Alexander Landau's. He descends from an aunt and an uncle of Alexander Landau. And in fact, Dave Rubin and his brother Brian Rubin are my fifth cousins, but in two different ways on the Landau line. So actually, I first found them through the Landau family. So he's already was on the tree. They were on the tree. They were Landau family cousins. And then I saw their last name. Their last name is Rubin. And I was like, okay, they're on the tree. Again, I was able to connect more with Dave's brother, Brian, but again, it applies to both of them. Let me take back the paternal line on their tree. Let's just see where it leads me. And, I'll add it to the tree and see, maybe there's a connection to our Rubin family. Maybe we'll see something. So what did I see when I built the tree back for Brian and Dave, the two brothers? Well, I could trace the line back all the way to Tarnów, which is the same city that our branch of the Rubin family was living in. And the earliest known ancestor was a man named Hirsch Rubin. If anyone has heard the previous presentations, Zvi Hirsch, is a very prominent common name in our Rubin family. In fact, Moses Rubin had a brother named Hirsch Rubin, who again died as a young man, but that was a name that was found in the family. And this Hirsch Rubin, he died in Tarnów in 1866. And unfortunately, you can see it here. This is from his death record. It just says Hirsch Rubin in Tarnów. It doesn't say who his father's name is. There's no mention of the father's name. And when I tried looking in the Tarnów cemetery, it doesn't look like that grave still exists today because it's not found in any database Okay, he's definitely buried in the Tarnów Cemetery, but maybe the grave decayed or whatnot. So we don't know Hirsch's father's name. So the trail runs cold. When you're looking at all the available documentation, there's nothing. It's just Hirsch Rubin. So I did something else, and that was I looked at all of Hirsch Rubin's descendants. Not even just the line that's, Dave's line and Brian's line. I looked at adjacent lines and looked at what the names of descendants were. And that's where I saw something very striking. And I show it here in the middle. Is that two different children of Hirsch Rubin, they have children of their own named Leah and Jacob, starting right after 1848. So in the case of this family, this actually is the direct ancestor of the Rubin line, of Brian Rubin's line. Alter was what he used later in life, but he was born Joseph Osias, which is Yosef Yoshua. He had a daughter named Leah in 1849, and then his first son, born after 1848, was a guy named Jacob Isaac. And the same thing was found in a daughter, Bela Rubin. This was the daughter of Hirsch Rubin. She had two children starting in after 1849. You have the Jacob name and the Leah name. Why was this so striking? Well, the earliest known ancestors is something that we discussed in the second presentation and the third presentation. The earliest known ancestors that we could trace definitively through our Rubin line was a couple named Yaakov, Jacob, and another name for Jacob, and Leah Rubin. That was the name of the couple. And we know that they died in 1848. And so the fact that there were Hirsch's children were naming children named Jacob and Leah in different branches was a strong signal to me. And we don't see the names occur before 1848 in any of these branches. This made me think that Hirsch was a son of Yaakov and Leah, that he was another child in another branch of the family. There was no information that was negative about it, right? That refuted that, but there was no other information that affirmed that aside from the names of these grandchildren. And I just want to say here, like Moses Rubin's siblings also have this Jacob and Leah names. We talked about this in the second presentation. Moses Rubin had a younger brother born in 1848 named Jacob Rubin. Again, that name. And then the first daughter that was born in the early 1850s, her name was Chaya Leah. She also had the Leah name. So again, in Ashkenazi naming, a name of a child is only given after a deceased ancestor, not a living ancestor. And so that's why these names start to appear after 1848, when those ancestors had passed away, when the older Yaakov and Leah, who lived in this town called Korchina, when they passed away. And so, according to my hypothesis, Ron and Brian, so Brian Rubin, again, is this brother of Dave who I connected with in Minneapolis, I believe they were fourth cousin 2 times removed. That's a really distant connection. But in the world of Y DNA, that's not so distant. We were talking about 500 years ago. So my hypothesis is that they would be from the same paternal line. And I wanted to take a Y-DNA test. And again, Brian Rubin was gracious enough to take a Y-DNA test. And I had a little bit of a heads up here because when you take an autosomal DNA test through Ancestry or 23andMe, you can also get some very basic Y-DNA information, and they were a match on this basic Y-DNA information. So I knew that they shared a common ancestor from 5600 BCE, but I wanted to see, were they actually much closer than that? Were they really from the same paternal line? And share a common ancestor from about, let's say, 1780. That would be when their common ancestor was born. Yaakov and Leah. So let's look at what Brian's results were. He received it back in July of 2022. So again, just a few months ago. And I was really excited because guess what? He is from the same paternal line as Ron Rubin. That Hirsch Rubin line is most definitely from the same Rubin line as our Rubin family. So how do we see this? So I talked about earlier about the big Y block tree with the different branches. And before Brian Rubin tested Ron was tested in this group called EFGC 68205. That's another name for that EA18889. But when Brian tested, a whole new branch of the tree formed. That was a sub-branch, or what we call a subclad of that group, called EFT49117. This is an important mutation to know of. So this mutation was what beforehand was what we call a private variant. This was a mutation that was known that only Ron Rubin had. No other Y-DNA tester in the world had this mutation, and so we called it a private variant. When Brian took the test, he also had that mutation. He's the only other Y-DNA tester in the whole world who's taken a big Y-DNA test who also has EFT49117. And so when they both shared that mutation, it no longer became private, it became public, and it became a new sub-branch of the tree. This is now a Rubin branch of the tree that's defined by a mutation that they both share, EFT49117. This process of creating a new subbranch in the tree of mankind, this is, again, part of this Ashkenazi branch, is like one of the most exciting parts of Y-DNA research. It's adding to our scientific knowledge. We now know that this mutation, this is like a Rubin family mutation that defines the Rubin line that these two testers share. So I was very excited when this occurred. And this is a different visualization on the left-hand side. So there's another website that I use. There's Family Tree DNA, but there's a website that's available more publicly to anyone to see that has the Y-DNA tree, and it's called YFull. And so I uploaded Ron Rubin and Brian Rubin's results to YFull, and you can see that they conduct their own analysis of the data, and they came to the same conclusion. You can see that they created a new subbranch within EA1889. That's the same name as, this is the name that's called in FTDNA. In Family Tree DNA, FGC68205, it's the same thing. But part of EA1889, it was this new mutation, FT49117, shared only by these two Rubin testers. These are the two Rubin testers here. And so what do these results prove? They prove that Brian Rubin is Ron Rubin's closest known relative along the paternal line among all the big Y-DNA testers. And this is very strongly supportive of a hypothesis that Ron and Brian both descend from Yaakov and Leah Rubin, that they both share that common ancestor. And so this is very strong evidence. They're certainly from the same paternal line. And it's closer than the last 500 years, right? We talked about 1889 being formed 500 years ago. FT49117 came about after that point, because no other of those testers share that except for the Rubin testers. And so what I like to call, when we have a situation like this, I called this, this mutation, FT49117, this constitutes Yaakov Rubin's Y-DNA SNP signature. It's a special mutation that signals that that mutation had arisen by the time their common ancestor, Yaakov Rubin, had been born. So when Yaakov Rubin, who married Leah, he was born in 1780, he was born with the FT49117 mutation, which he passed down to his two sons, our ancestor Menachem Mendel, and his ancestor, Brian Rubin's ancestor, Hirsch Rubin, and they carried it down to the present day. Okay, so we call it the Y-DNA SNP signature. What that means is that any descendant of Yaakov Rubin along the paternal line, we would now expect them to be part of this group. They would have to share this mutation. Otherwise, they're not part of the family. We can easily find inclusion criteria for future testers along the line. Okay, do you have any questions about this before we move on to part 3? So this was a very exciting, and what we basically did is, through Y-DNA, prove a whole nother branch of the Rubin line. And again, there was some, hints towards that led us that direction, but the Y-DNA provided the much stronger evidence, the scientific evidence of that. Does anyone have any questions about that? All right, going once, going twice. All right, I know this is a longer presentation, but we're getting to the end here. So we're going to talk about part 3. This is the late breaking research that literally just in the last week we got some more data on. And again, all of this data came after our last presentation in later in November. So we're going to talk about a tester named Kalman Masri, and he's in quotation marks for a reason, and his Y-DNA test. And we're going to talk about a connection to a rabbi named Naftali Tzvi Horovitz, the founder of the Ropshitz Hasidic dynasty. So let's go into this. So in our last presentation, in the third presentation on the series, I presented a hypothesis. And that hypothesis was, we talked about Yaakov Rubin, who died in 1848. Well, from his grave, what I believed was his grave, we found a grave that said Yaakov, the son of Yehoshua Rubin, who was the Av Beit Din of a town called Rimanov, which means he was the father, Yehoshua. Yaakov's father, Yehoshua, was this rabbi in Rimanov, and from that information, I was able to connect it to this rabbinic Rubin family that lived in southern Poland, and we can trace the line back into the mid 1600s. So one famous cousin of Yaakov Rubin, if this was true, is a guy named Naftali Tzvi Horovitz. He's the founder of the Ropshitz Hasidic line. And again, we talk about all of this, and in the third presentation, you can definitely look back at that presentation or reference the video on YouTube to go back into that in more detail. But I wanted to go back and just show you a visualization here on the top of where we think the hypothesized connections are. So again, this is Ron Rubin on the top, and this is the line through Menachem Mendel Rubin. Our line, Moses Rubin, is the same descendant of Menachem Mendel Rubin. This is the common ancestor with our line with Ron Rubin. And then Brian Rubin connects one generation further back with Yaakov Rubin in the black. He's the common ancestor. He had the son Hirsch and Menachem Mendel, and we've proven that they're from the same paternal line from their test. Now, the Holy Grail was, can we find a descendant of Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Horovitz, a male line descendant, and see, is this hypothesis of being from the same Rubin family, is there any credence to it? So earlier, I made iterations of these presentations, and there were other testers within Ron Rubin's line. In fact, Moshe Sachs, in particular, he's from the same paternal line. He was very interested in this connection to the Ropshitz Hasidim because he's a Chassid himself and lives in Brooklyn. And he has connections to people in the Hasidic community in Brooklyn. And he's like, you know what? There are a lot of male line descendants of Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Horovitz today who are Hasidim, and I'm going to find one and get that person tested. And so he, along with some other people in the Hasidic community who I've connected with, who are interested in this and tracing the Y-DNA line, they found such a tester. But I do not know the name of this tester. They have provided me his pseudonym, and his name is Kalman Masri. That's what I'm going to be referring to him. I don't know his real name, but his last name is Horovitz because he descends from this Horovitz family. And what I want to just reiterate again is this family does not have the Rubin surname, but they actually are from the Rubin paternal line. Rabbi Naftali Tzvi Horovitz, this is something we talked about at the last presentation. His mother had the surname Horovitz. It was from a very famous rabbinic family, and so he adopted his mother's surname. But we know his father was a guy named Menachem Mendel Rubin, and he was actually, along the paternal line, he was a Rubin. And so we could actually look at his paternal line of descent and compare that with our knowledge of our Rubin line to see if there's any connection. And so we finally found this tester, Kalman Masri. He agreed to get tested. He was tested in September, and he received his big Y-DNA results just a week or two ago. So the big question is, would big Y-DNA testing provide evidence that Kalman Masri was connected to our Rubin family? And by doing so, it would prove a lot of things, right? First of all, if it was true, it would prove that we are cousins with the Ropshitz Hasidic line. It would provide scientific proof. But it would also prove that that grave that started this whole research in Korchin in 1848, that actually is our ancestors' grave. So there was a lot riding on it. Sometimes you got to take some risks and like go for the scientific proof, and that's something that I really sought for. So I was really excited when we were able to test common Masri, and again, this all came together within a period of months. Usually, it can take a lot longer to find these types of testers. So, without further ado, what did we find out? All right, so we got his big Y DNA results just in the last week or two, and guess what? He is very closely connected to the other two Rubin testers. In fact, he now became the third known tester in the world to also have the FT49117 mutation, which is the same mutation that the other two Rubins have. And I think this is like the most beautiful slide in the presentation because it's beautiful. You can see all these different branches of Ashkenazi Jews, and these were two other targeted tests. This is from Ron Rubin's perspective, looking at his branch of the family, and it's Brian Rubin, and it's Kalman Masri. Again, the pseudonym for the Horovitz descendant. So it's clear that the two Rubin testers are Kalman's closest connections. Among the big Y700 testers, you can see it very clearly because they all share this, later occurring mutation, FT49117, that only those three testers have. The other thing I would just point out here, I have it as a subnote here, is that just over the last few months of testing, we've seen more subbranches form. So before, there was just this EFGC68205. When Ron Rubin took his test, all the testers were all just part of this group. Then FT49117 formed. But adjacent to that, now the Nachod line actually formed their own branch that was more recent today. And they matched with a guy named Matityahu Deutsch. So these two testers are more closely connected to each other than they are to the Rubin branch. But they form like a whole nother branch that broke off after 500 years ago. It's just very interesting. And this just goes to the point that, as more people take tests, we're going to see even more differentiation and more of the tree will come alive, basically, and new branches are going to form. It's not just in the Rubin line. It can be in adjacent lines like the Nachod line. All right. So this is a bit of a crowded slide and a little bit complicated because it shows a little bit of additional information. And so I did the same thing where I uploaded Kalman's YDNA information to YFOL, this alternative website that does their analysis. And they also placed Kalman in EFT49117. But they found something else, which is also very interesting. And they actually, this is something that we actually expect to see in family tree DNA, probably over the coming weeks. Family tree DNA, again, this is all such new information. It just came out in the last week or two. But YFOL's information says, actually, these three testers don't just share one mutation that the rest of the testers don't have, but there's a second mutation, and that's separated by this star. They also share this mutation, BY42456. What that means is these three Rubin testers share two mutations that all these other testers don't have. And that's actually very important to know. Not for learning about like the Rubin line necessarily, but being able to connect with the other testers who are further back in time from 500 years ago. Not only did one mutation arise that separates them from the other testers, but there probably are two different mutations. So again, if we're dating a mutation arises anywhere between 50 and 150 years, right, we're saying that it's at least 100 years before FT49111. Any connection has to occur at least 100 years ago, but maybe even further, right? It could be well back. It could be 200 years back. It could be quite a bit of time that connects these Rubin testers with all the other known testers, because there are now two known mutations that are unique to the Rubin line. Okay, so the other important point is that this helps refine the dating for when these mutations arose. FT49117 and then this new one that was found, BY42456. So previously we had said FT49117, that mutation existed when Yaakov Rubin, Yaakov Rubin, who was not a rabbi, whose father was a rabbi, when he was born, he had that mutation. But actually, we can refine that analysis. And we can actually say because Kalman also has these mutations, it means that these are actually more ancient mutations. And that they existed back when all three common ancestors. So when we go back on the slide here, what we're talking about is that these mutations existed when all the common ancestors, Rav Yaakov Rubin of Linsk, Rav Naftali Tzvi Horovitz's grandfather, and Yaakov Rubin's grandfather, when he was born, he already carried these mutations. It's not just Yaakov Rubin who carried these mutations. It was the grandfather, the rabbi in Linsk, who we talked about in the third presentation. It was he who already had these mutations. And what's interesting is that what we can say is that both of these mutations that characterize the Rubin line, they must have arisen no later than around 1695. They actually came about over 300 years ago. They came into the world. And what's also interesting is Ron and Brian, who are more closely connected, right? They descend from a common ancestor who's more 2 generations born in the future. Yaakov Rubin, who's the grandson of the Rabbi Yaakov Rubin, when that Yaakov Rubin was born, he didn't have any additional mutations. He had the Y DNA was passed without any new mutations over those 2 generations. So what we can say is, between the birth of Rabbi Yaakov Rubin and when the grandson Yaakov Rubin, who's Ron Rubin and Brian Rubin's common ancestor, no new mutations arose. So there was, when we say 50 to 150 years, it was at least more than 80 years, probably over 100 years between any new mutations arising in our branch of the family. And that the line, that mutation, which we previously said had to be around from about 1780, actually, these mutations arose as no later than 1695. And so we can refine the signature. Instead of saying that the FT49117 and BY42456, that they were the Yaakov Rubin Y-DNA SNP signature, actually, they are Rabbi Yaakov Rubin, the Beit Din of Linska's Y-DNA SNP signature. Any male line descendant from that rabbi is now expected to carry these 2 mutations, as we've seen with these 3 testers. And I just wanted to say that, just to put a check on the time period here, Family Tree DNA, they put an estimate on when they believe the FT49117. It's just an estimate. They know nothing about the family trees, okay? They're not looking at that at all. Just based off of the math and when mutations arise. They said, and you can see it over here, they said, we think FT49117 came into the world around 1750 CE. That's pretty darn close to 1700, which is when our common ancestor was born. And in fact, there were no new mutations between 1700 and 1780 on our line. So it was true. It was characterized that in 1750, that was the same set of mutations that existed. So again, this is just a check. It's not like it's saying that, that an independent analysis, basically just based off of the mutations, also links up very well with the dating that I put forth in the tree. So I want to get to this big summary slide to just pull it all together. And so, at first we talked about the big Y DNA testing from Ron Rubin's test, and it showed that the paternal line descends from a large and well-known Ashkenazi Jewish line that is one of the founding Jewish lineages, EM123. Again, there are a lot of Jewish lineages among that. And all available evidence points to the Rubin ancestral line being located in the Levant going back to biblical times. So that was the first half of the presentation. And then, through the additional big Y DNA test of Brian Rubin and the pseudonym Kalman Mastri, we were able to learn that all 3 testers are from the same paternal line, with a common shared ancestor dating back to about 1700 CE. And the DNA evidence, as I outlined, is strongly supportive of all of the theorized connections I had talked about in the second and third presentations previously. Now, again, I wanted to just highlight the third point is important. While it is theorized that Brian and Ron are more closely connected to each other than Kalman, The big Y DNA testing is unable to differentiate that closeness between the three testers. And again, what that suggests is that there were just no new mutations that arose during the 2 generations that separate the Rubin testers from Kalm and Masri. So Y-DNA is a tool, right? It's a tool in a genealogist's toolbox. And it can be used, it's best used in conjunction with traditional genealogy research. On its own, it can provide some information about the ancient line, but you also need to have traditional genealogy research. And so what did we use Y-DNA in this case? We used big Y-DNA testing to provide scientific evidence supporting the theorized relationship between the Rubin testers. Again, this was a new line of the Rubin family that was theorized based off of the traditional genealogy research. It seemed to point in that direction. And based off of the information I was able to gather about the Rupshitz Hasidic dynasty, I had this hypothesis that I then was able to test scientifically through the Y-DNA testing. And if I hadn't done the research going into any of this, we would never have discovered any of this, right? We wouldn't have been able to find this. So it's important to do the genealogy research to then allow you to be able to follow on with the Y-DNA testing to further prove it out scientifically. And then lastly, what we've learned from this is that there are 2 mutations, FT49117 and BY42456, that are the defining mutations of the Rubin paternal line. And this can help with finding Rubin family members in the future. I love this picture off to the right that I found because this is the synergy between traditional genealogy research and DNA research. And in this case, it's Y-DNA research, all coming together to prove each other out. And so, next steps. There's always more that can be done, although I will say the majority of the work is done now, learning about the Rubin line. So one thing that I would like to do is do further Y-DNA testing of our Rubin family, but a little bit closer to the present day. So maybe we can find a closer connection to Ron Rubin, who descends from Menachem Mendel Rubin, the son of Yaakov Rubin, and who's our shared ancestor with Ron Rubin, Menachem Mendel Rubin. Maybe we can find another Rubin family member, and there are those that exist around the world today who could take a test, and maybe we could find the creation of another mutation. So, and the reason why I say that is Ron Rubin has 4 private mutations. So, in his line, there are 4 new mutations that arose from the birth of Yaakov Rubin up until his birth. In the mid 20th century. And so it is possible that a more recent ancestor from, let's say, Menachem Mendel Rubin, who's closer to our, could share one of those mutations. And that can help us, again, with dating the tree. We could date a mutation to a specific ancestor, Menachem Mendel Rubin, if that's the case. And so that's something that I would be looking to do, is to try and find a closer relative. We would expect that relative to share those 2 mutations that are the Rubin family, but there's a possibility he might share 1 extra mutation with Ron Rubin that no one else shares. Then the other thing is that there is a lot of interest among the Hasidim, who I've mentioned before, to test more from the Rupshitz Hasidic family. They are excited by all of this, and so they're trying to find more descendants of Naftali Tzvi Horovitz, and we could do something similar. If we find 2 descendants from different sons of Naftali Tzvi Horovitz, we could determine maybe there was a mutation that was born, that Naftali Tzvi Horovitz was born with, that he passed on to his descendants, that could be the defining mutation of a sub-branch for the Horovitz family. And so we might be able to do that by doing further testing. But as I said, the major work is done, is proving out that all these families are from the same paternal line, which is, to me, the most important thing. And so this is the end of my presentation. I really want to thank a number of individuals. Again, all genealogy research and DNA research is all about collaboration. First and foremost, I want to give a special thank you to a man named Igor Schein. He runs a group that does a ton of research into the Ashkenazi Jewish line that the Rubin family is a part of. And he has spent enormous amounts of time explaining things with me. He edited this presentation for me just this weekend. He's just been a fantastic resource and cannot thank him enough for his help with explaining the earlier history of the Rubin line. And then I want to call out two other individuals, Yoel Schwartz and Moshe Landau. They were the Hasidim who helped find and test Kalman Masri for me. I'm indebted to them because it would have been much more difficult for me to find such a descendant. And they've been incredibly gracious to find and do the extensive testing and to help, provide me with that information so that I could upload it to YFOL as well. So I'm immensely grateful to them, and hopefully they'll be able to find more testers from this Hasidic line that we can do some more extensive testing. And then finally, I just want to thank the testers themselves, Ron Rubin in Long Island, Brian Rubin in Minneapolis, and Kalman Masri, who we don't know his real name, for taking these Y-DNA tests. It's really, sometimes it can be an uphill battle to convince people to take these Y-DNA tests and to explain the importance of it. But I think with every tester who I explain it to, after they take the test, they're very excited and very happy that they took it. I'm really grateful that all three took these tests, because without them, we wouldn't have any of this knowledge. So a big thank you to them. So with that is the end of my presentation. I do have several important slides in the appendix that I do recommend that you look at, because it just has some added information and context for some of the materials that we talked about today. But I didn't think it merited being part of the presentation. So with that, what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop my screen share, and I'm going to first stop the presentation, then stop the screen share.